Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Immigration History Research Center's program, Immigrant Detention, History, Rights, and What's Next. We are going to begin our formal program in just a few minutes, but in the meantime, we will begin with this book trailer for Professor Eliot Young's book, Forever Prisoners, created by Zulema Young Toledo. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Immigration History Research Center. I'm Erika Lee, director of the center. We were trying to show a book trailer of Professor Eliot Young's book, Forever Prisoners. We're experiencing a few technical difficulties, so we are going to go ahead and start with our program. But before I begin, I would like to provide a few housekeeping guidelines and then introduce speakers. So first, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. The question and answer portion will happen via the Q&A function in Zoom. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation. We'll turn to audience questions, though, at the end of the program. You can choose to submit questions anonymously if you do not want your name to be mentioned when the question is posted. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome two colleagues to our Zoom gathering. First is Eliot Young. He is a professor in the history department at Lewis and Clark College. Professor Young is the author of many books, including Alien Nation, Chinese Migration in the Americas from the Coolie era through World War II, as well as Catarina Garza's Revolution on the Texas-Mexico border, and the new book, Forever Prisoners, How the United States Made the World's Largest Immigrant Detention System. He is also co-editor of Continental Crossroads, Remapping the US-Mexico Borderlands, and is co-founder of the Tebotsalan Institute for Transnational History of the Americas. He has provided expert witness testimony for over 350 asylum cases, which we will hear about shortly. So I'm going to welcome Professor Young to present, and then when we turn to our conversation, I will then introduce our other guest speaker, Professor Linus Tan. But first, Professor Young, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Hannah, for organizing this, and Professor Linus Tan for joining me today. So I'm going to give a brief talk, and I'm going to, in a second, bring up some slides from the book as well. So I'm going to first share my screen. So the United States locks up more than 500,000 foreigners every year for immigration-related offenses. As of last year, more than 50,000 immigrants, men, women, and children, were being caged in hundreds of ICE detention facilities on any given day. We know these grim statistics, but the numbers do not tell us the stories of the families who have been torn apart, of the people who spent years behind bars for simply seeking a better life in this country, or of the fear that people live in even when they are not incarcerated. Forever Prisoners is the history of how, where, and why non-citizens were put behind bars in the United States from the late 19th century to the present, and how this country built the largest immigrant detention system in the world. But mostly, in writing this book, I wanted to tell stories of individuals and families that have been caught in the gears of a detention and deportation machine that chews up and spits out immigrants at an alarming rate. The book is told through 5 distinct stories that move chronologically through time and cover different types of incarceration. In the mid-1880s, Chinese were being purged from towns up and down the Pacific coast, spurred on by angry white working class mobs and government officials who feared economic competition and who viewed the Chinese as a danger to the purity of America as a white ethno-state. In the wake of those pogroms, increasing numbers of Chinese were being picked up for unauthorized presence in the country and sent to the remote McNeil Island federal prison off the coast of Seattle. Judges were invoking the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first piece of federal immigration restrictionist legislation, but they were also being sentenced to 6 months of hard labor at the prison. Even though unauthorized presence was not a criminal offense, they were being given criminal penalties without the benefit of a judicial trial, in clear violation of the constitutional right to due process. After their 6-month punishment had expired, US government marshals attempted to return them to Canada from whence they came, in the language of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Ever since this act prohibited the entry of Chinese laborers, Chinese used Canada, Mexico, and Cuba as springboards to enter the US clandestinely. And my previous book, Alienation, talks about that, clandestine entering into the United States from those countries. However, at this point, Canada had already established its own restrictions against the Chinese, a head tax required to be paid by every Chinese entrant. And so when the Chinese were brought to by the marshals to the border, when the Chinese could not pay the head tax, the Canadians refused their entry, and the Chinese were sent back to McNeil Island prison, where they faced indefinite detention. For years, scores of Chinese were being piled up at McNeil Island while the government figured out what to do with them. Finally, in 1890, the first deportations of Chinese back to China began from McNeil Island, sparking 130 years of detentions and deportations. Several of these Chinese died while awaiting deportation at McNeil Island, spending their last days on Earth behind bars. In the early 20th century, millions of Europeans were being processed through Ellis Island. One of those was Nathan Cohen, a Russian Jew who had lived for several years in Brazil. Cohen went to live with his uncle in rural Georgia, but within a few months, his family members swindled him out of his business venture. His wife left him for his best friend, and Cohen was left broke and bereft. He sunk into a deep depression and became mute. He was finally sent to a public mental hospital in Baltimore, where doctors declared him insane. And then immigration agents ordered his deportation, citing the ban on entry of insane aliens. Cohen was escorted to Ellis Island and a few months later put on a ship going to Brazil. However, Brazil refused to allow him to enter. The ship continued on to Buenos Aires, to Argentina. Argentina also refused to allow him to enter, and Russia indicated it didn't want anything to do with Cohen. At this point, they're basically pogroms trying to kick out Jews from Russia. And so this mute, depressed man's story was picked up in the US press, referring to him as, quote, the wandering Jew or the man without a country. This Pittsburgh Press story on the slide indicated, quote, "He has no address, belongs nowhere, is wanted nowhere." Cohen was returned to New York on the same ship and spent many months locked up on Ellis Island. When the government attempted to deport him for a second time, the same thing happened as before, and Cohen ended up back in New York Harbor. Only this time, the government issued orders to not even allow Cohen off the ship. With the intercession of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid and Sheltering Society and a fraternal organization, the Knights of Pythias, Cohen was finally allowed to land when these organizations committed to paying for his upkeep at a private sanitarium in Connecticut. Within the year, however, Nathan Cohen, who was just in his mid-30s at that point, had died. He was buried in Staten Island, and the newspaper quipped that the man who had no home had finally found a resting place in the country that refused him. Aside from the tragic and epic nature of Cohen's story, this episode points to a larger truth that huge numbers of foreigners and citizens were being incarcerated in mental hospitals in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, far more immigrants were locked up in so-called insane asylums than in immigrant detention facilities or even jails and prisons. And this chart shows you correct people in corrections facilities, and then the orange bar shows people in mental hospitals. And you could see that up until 1970, most people, and these are not just foreigners, this is total numbers, but most people who were incarcerated were in mental hospitals. And then since the 1970s, those proportions flip. During World War II, the US engaged in a secretive program in Latin America to kidnap Japanese, Germans, and Italians living there and forcibly bring them to the United States. They were labeled enemy aliens based on no evidence and held in INS detention camps in Texas and New Mexico. They were supposed to be used as pawns for a prisoner exchange with American civilians held by Axis powers. I follow the story of Seiichi Higashide and his family, who ended up in a camp in Crystal City, Texas, which happens to be 40 miles from Dilley, Texas, where ICE currently detains families from Central America. After the war, Peru refused to accept the Japanese Peruvians, even ones who had been born in Peru. And thus they remained as quasi-stateless people who were forced into farm labor camps until they could resolve their immigration situation. By 1953, Congress acted to allow these Japanese Peruvians to gain legal residence, but they were never included in the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, which provided reparations to interned Japanese Americans. This episode during World War II demonstrates how national security, foreign policy, and immigration law came together, leading to the incarceration of immigrants. While the Japanese Peruvians were not typical immigrants in that they did not come to the country voluntarily, they were labeled as, quote, illegal entrants by the government and placed in INS detention camps. In 1954, the INS announced a new policy that they would end immigrant detention at seaports. However, at the very same time, millions of Mexicans on the southern border were being arrested, detained for short periods of time, and deported from the country. Immigrant detention did not end so much as shift location and focus much more on one group, Mexicans. And then in the 1970s, thousands of Haitians began to arrive in Florida, fleeing political violence at home. Instead of welcoming these largely Black refugees, they were placed in mass detention camps and almost universally denied asylum. In 1980, a massive boat lift of Cubans from the port of Mariel outside of Havana arrived in Florida. This group, like the Haitians before them, were largely poor and darker skinned. They too were placed in mass detention camps on military bases around the country, including at McNeil Island Prison. Most of the Mariel refugees were paroled into the United States, but some of them committed criminal offenses, mostly low-level drug charges, before their immigration status could be legalized. After serving their time, these Cubans were then sent to Atlanta Penitentiary and a federal immigration detention center in Oakdale, Louisiana, where they were pending deportation. The problem was that Cuba refused to accept them, and so they languished in prison for years, some more than a decade, waiting for a deportation that would never come. Finally, in November 1987, the US negotiated the return of over 2,000 of these Mariel refugees. When the Cubans heard their deportation was imminent, they seized the prison in Oakdale and Atlanta, taking over 100 guards as hostages and torching buildings. And here are some images from Atlanta in 1987, where the Cubans burnt or set on fire a number of these buildings. Here are some other images from the takeover, where they seized this prison. Here you could see them with an FBI agent displaying some of their homemade weapons during the takeover. Here's another image of the Cubans on the roof with the American and Cuban flag and an image of Santa Claus. This is right before Christmas time. And then this image shows families outside of the Atlanta Penitentiary who would come and do vigils. In this case, this family member is dressed up as the Statue of Liberty. After 2 weeks, the longest prison takeover in US history ended with the government agreeing to individual reviews of their cases. The story of the Mariel Cubans reveals the increasing linking of criminal law on the one hand and immigration law on the other hand, which began in the 1980s and then continued to become more and more enmeshed in the 1990s. Following the prison uprising, Congress would enact laws that increasingly tied immigration and criminal law together, leading to an ever wider net for immigrant detention and deportation. Finally, this brings me to the last story in the book, which focuses on Myra Machado, a Salvadoran who was brought to this country when she was just 5 years old. Myra is depicted there on the left with her children. By the time she was an adult, she was living in Arkansas, and at 18, she wrote a hot check and was charged. Even though the judge recognized that this was a first-time offense, she ended up with a suspended 10-year sentence of stacked charges that stemmed from this one fraudulent check. A decade later, in 2015, she was picked up on a minor traffic violation. But by this time, President Obama had expanded the programs that deputized local law enforcement as immigration agents. And so instead of simply paying for a traffic ticket, she was taken from her 3 US citizen children and put in detention in Louisiana. I helped in her asylum case as an expert witness on country conditions in El Salvador, but she was deported in early 2017. In El Salvador, she faced harassment by government officials and gang members who threatened her with sexual assault. Missing her children, she returned to the US after a few months, and a year later was again picked up on a traffic violation and again sent to detention in rural Louisiana. It was in this geo-run ICE facility that Myra organized her own legal filings for asylum and called me up on the phone to act as an expert witness. I was able to secure for her a pro bono lawyer, but she lost her case again. And this is a picture of us at the Lasalle Detention Center in Louisiana with Myra's mother and sister and 2 of her children. While her appeal was still pending in the Fifth Circuit Court in early 2020, she was put on a plane in the middle of the night back to El Salvador, where she lives today, still separated from her 3 young children. Myra's case reveals the problematic Obama-era policies that said they were focusing enforcement on felons, not families. Myra was, of course, both a felon and a mother. The ways in which the laws had changed and invented new categories like aggravated felony served to criminalize people like Myra, who are not, in fact, a threat to anyone. The title of the book comes from the name that journalists have given the prisoners who've been held at Guantanamo, some for almost 2 decades without any charges or convictions. Although most immigrants are not like the prisoners in Guantanamo in that they came to the United States voluntarily, they too often face indefinite detention and a situation of rightlessness that follows them even if they are released. The United States once prided itself on being a nation of immigrants, but it has become a nation of immigrant prisons. Thank you.
Thanks, Elliot. Thank you for the brief introduction into your book. Now joining us for our conversation is my colleague, Linus Chan. Linus is an associate professor of clinical law and the director of the Detainee Rights Clinic at the University of Minnesota Law School. He's an immigration attorney, and his work focuses on removal defense for those detained by immigration and customs enforcement. He also teaches in the area of the intersection of criminal and immigration law. So I'm so excited to have you join us, Linus, and for your comments, reflections on the history of immigrant detention, as well as sharing with us the work of the Detainee Rights Clinic.
Well, thank you very much, Erika, and the Immigrant History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. And it was a definite pleasure for me to get my hands on an early copy of Professor Young's book, and I devoured it with great, well, I wouldn't say relish, a little bit of trepidation, and of course, seeing on the printed paper some of what I have had a chance, unfortunately, to get to see in person. So I have been in immigration. It's very interesting. I just reflected it recently, where I have been an immigration attorney doing work with detained non-citizens or immigrants. And this is my 4th presidential administration doing this work. And it's sort of it gave me a chance, of course, reading over Professor Young's book, as well as to reflect over and preparing for today's conversation about what that has meant and what that has felt like. It was a very strange thing during the beginning. I started doing this work in the summer or fall of 2004. I just started with a nonprofit organization called the National Immigrant Justice Center. It used to be called the Midwest Immigrant Human Rights Center out in Chicago. And when I started, I was one of 2 detained immigration attorneys working in Chicago. And our job was to represent people who were detained by ICE. Now, Chicago and Minnesota has a very similar system in that the people who are detained by ICE in both Chicago and in Minnesota are actually housed at county jails. And I had a little bit of background in doing criminal defense work prior to doing immigration work. And so it was a little bit of a surreal experience in that I was no longer visiting people in jails in order to talk about their criminal convictions, or at least that's the feel of it's supposed to be. Instead, I was there to talk about their history of being in the United States and whether or not they would want to try to stay in the United States. And it was very interesting to see one thing that really played out very strongly, a little bit in like Professor Young's first chapter as he mentioned, was talking about the Chinese being held at McNeil Island Prison. And so when you first go out to visit clients, you're visiting them at a county jail. The clients are, of course, and as it was wonderfully illustrated by Professor Young's photograph of the McNeil Island, they're all wearing prison garb. Now, the difference between the 1910 version of the McNeil Island prison guard using black stripes that kind of evoke the sense of, like, for my generation, perhaps the Hamburglar from McDonald's, to now seeing people in orange jumpsuits. And those orange jumpsuits haven't changed during my entire time. So when I first started seeing my clients out in county jails in Chicago, and when I see my clients now in county jails here in Minnesota, they're all wearing very similar garb. They're in jumpsuits. And similarly, when they are going in front of an immigration judge, and Professor Elliott's last picture of Myra was illustrative of that, when she's in court and she's trying to talk to her children, she's of course in that prison jumpsuit, and very often, in fact, there's only very few exceptions, that people are in fact shackled, right? They're shackled, they're preparing to hear their case, they are in front of a judge, and it is meant to invoke a sense of what the view of the US government is of them. And as Professor Young talked about in the Chinese example, these people were being punished, and even though later a Supreme Court decision overturned this, they were being sentenced to hard labor for the crime of migration or being here unlawfully. And here, while we don't technically have the punishment of hard labor, the question of this civil process, which is what we call deportation, we call it a civil process. And the criminal process is really one that is more wielded as a weapon rather than as a shield. And one of the first things that is a teaching experience for my students to think about is, if you were to ask people, would you prefer to have to go under a civil process to decide whether or not you would be punished for something, or a criminal process in order for you to be punished for something? I think most people would instinctively say civil, that it invokes this idea that the stakes are not as high, that you might have to pay a fine. Just as a matter of fact, today I went and paid a speeding ticket, right? That's a civil process. I can pay a check. I never had to worry about going to jail. But what immigration detention has done, and it's transformed, is that by taking a civil process, but invoking a requirement of detention, and detention that involves jail, that involves the exact same trappings that people would have to go through if they were on trial for a crime, it has made the entire system as a factory of criminality, as a way of imposing a norm of criminality throughout the whole thing. So one of the things that is difficult about the work and going out is trying to tease out what that connection between the criminal process and the civil process. And I just want to share with you, when I first started doing this work, at least there was among the activists that were doing immigrant rights, this was during the period of time where there was a push for the DREAM Act, and then later on, the Sensenbrenner bill, and there was a lot of push to recognize people and get, DACA, and the idea that being undocumented to get them rights. And one of the common refrain people would say is, we're not criminals, right? We're not criminals. Immigration is a civil process. It's, again, relying on that civil criminal divide. And unfortunately, I think what that ended up doing is trying to do something which was keep at one side and preserve what later on President Obama sort of used in his announcement for immigration priorities, this whole felons, not families. And as Professor Young very quickly explained, especially with the story of Myra Machado, was, well, felons have families, right? They're not all that different. And really having to really come to terms more recently about the actual enmeshed aspect of the criminal justice system and the immigration system is something that we see all the time, right? This is when we are making a push for having more oversight from the state to immigration for county jails, because my clients are in county jails. Well, the byproduct, of course, is that that would mean more oversight for people being held for criminal charges. While county jails right now are usually not held accountable for a lot of aspects of what's going on. For instance, there's been a lot of in the news talking about MEND, which is a healthcare provider that's been found to be providing substandard health. Well, guess what? County jails generally use those services in order to provide healthcare because they're cheaper and they don't necessarily provide the best care. And then, so when I came to Minnesota, I was very aware of the fact that the system of using county jails was what was here. And at first, there's other aspects. So we talked about the Seminole criminal divide, and we talked about this criminality. The other thing that is really difficult for people to sort of process is that the entire aspect of immigration detention, on top of a set of procedures, is what causes, I think, one of the largest harms. Professor Young talks quite a bit in his book about the seeming never-ending detention, right? That's why the title is Forever Prisoners. And in my work with my students, when we see and we talk to our clients, I always prepare my students before we meet with clients for the first time, that the number one question that every single person in immigration detention will ask us is, when will we get out? When will we be allowed to be free? Now, it is an absolutely expected, reasonable question that, of course, is on the front of everyone's mind. And one of the most difficult things that I have to explain to my students is we do not have a good answer. Immigration detention can vary. It can be as little as a week to as long as 2-3 years, and in, of course, some extreme cases, even decades. Professor Elliot has an example of one such case that took quite that long, but the whole point of it is it's not just the length. One of the things I found really interesting in talking to people who've been through both the criminal justice system and the immigration system is, at least when the criminal justice system is telling you you're going to be imprisoned, they give you a date. They tell you how long. It may be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, or even longer, but they give you a date. Immigration detention, they don't. Sometimes the date is only based on how long the process will take. And the process could take, again, anywhere between a week if you're willing to give up your rights, and much longer if you're not willing to give up your rights. But even if you are willing to give up your rights, because detention is predicated on removal, if a person is from a country that, as Professor Young talked about, if you're Cuban, well, guess what? You may end up being in detention for much, much longer, because Cuba itself, you become sort of a pawn between two countries when your country of citizenship no longer wants you, and the country that you've called your home also no longer wants you. So the fact that this completely indeterminate sentencing of time in immigration detention is another real big challenge. But the last thing I want to talk about too, and I think it's really highlighted by the last chapter of Professor Young's book, which is the idea and the fact that everything is arbitrary. And what I mean by that is the immigration detention system is not designed to say, like, if you didn't do something that egregious, we will only give you this amount of time in detention, while if you do something egregious, we're going to punish you for a longer period of time. And that's because immigration detention is not supposed to be punishment. But that makes it worse. It makes it worse because people who are in immigration detention have a harder time understanding how and what the whole system is about. People with shoplifting convictions can spend years fighting out their immigration case, while people with more serious crimes can be getting out within weeks. It is not dependent on any form of feeling of what is the actual just result is what can happen in immigration detention. So I wanted to just end here with a little note about what we're seeing with the brand new Biden administration. And right away, one of the most controversial things we're seeing is this 100-day moratorium. And just now, today, in lawsuits filed by the state of Texas, the issue that has become the heart of this question is whether or not the government thought they needed to release everyone in immigration detention. And that is being used by the state of Texas, the Tucker Carlson piece on this, whether or not that meant this is illegal. And I wanted that to sink in. The idea here is, hey, these people are being detained, and whether the president has the authority to somehow order their release is what Texas is suing on, because they don't feel that that is a good way to handle immigration, that releasing people and continuing to detain people should and must be upheld under the statute. And so I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. And I just want to say I'm thankful for the opportunity, and I'd love to hear more questions from people.
Thanks so much, Linus. By the way, I see we're matching. We didn't coordinate this, but you know, this is how we roll at University of Minnesota, I'm just gonna say.
Exactly. We just need a little gold pin.
I know. I'm sure that'll come soon. Thanks so much for those comments, that insight. I want to bring Elliot back onto the screen, into the Zoom room, while we start our conversation. And I wanted to pivot to just recognize where we are today. You know, this is what historians do. We're really good at marking change over time, because we're experiencing just this whiplash of policies as we transition from, of course, the Trump era's really historically punitive assault on immigration to an emerging Biden era that has begun with a flurry of executive orders last week, rescinding the Muslim ban, stopping construction of the border wall, rolling back massive enforcement in the interior, protecting and fortifying DACA. The 100-day moratorium on deportation went into effect on Friday. And I know we'll get to the Biden policies in a little bit, but I also think it's important to just mark this moment of transition, and to ask both of you, because I know in both the work that you do in the classrooms, in detention centers, as well as your own writing and public scholarship, that you've been very affected by the past 4 years. So I just wanted to ask, have you been able to reflect on what the past 4 years has been like for you? Is it too soon to feel like we're turning the page, or do you feel like this has the past 4 years and the Trump administration's immigration policies have inextricably changed what you do, your work as a historian, your work as a lawyer, that's not necessarily going to go away, even though Trump is no longer in the White House? Elliot, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, I feel like for 4 years I've been on a treadmill, and after the election there was a bit of relief, and then January 6th happens, and it's like, oh my God, like we're still in this. So I feel stressed out all over again. I don't think it's, unfortunately, just the last 4 years. If it were just about Trump, I think, you sign some executive orders, it would be very easy to reverse it. This is about a long-standing bipartisan policy to criminalize immigrants that, the book shows goes all the way back to the late 19th century. But if we're looking, 1980s, 1990s to the present, we could see this. And in terms of unprecedented punitiveness, Obama, not in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of actual people deported, has that dubious honor. Trump, I think tried to do it, but for a variety of different reasons wasn't able to deport as many people as he wanted. So yes, I am hopeful. I think the signs are good, but a lot of the signs that we see from Biden are the same kind of signals that we got from Obama in terms of comprehensive immigration reform going through Congress, and then we're going to change our priorities. The question is, can he actually implement this to make sure that ICE is not, in fact, picking up lots of people without criminal convictions on the one hand, and two, what about all the people with the criminal convictions like Myra Machado, who should not be in detention? So I think that the more pressing issue is, what can Biden do himself to end immigrant detention and the criminalization? And he actually has the power. I'm not a lawyer, but I believe he has the power to commute those federal sentences, for illegal entry, illegal reentry. That's something he could do. He doesn't need Republicans to do that. So if he really wants to make those changes, I feel like we in the advocacy community should be pushing for Biden to do what he can do with his presidential powers.
Linus, how have the past 4 years been for you? And do you have any insight into Elliot's question about what Biden can or cannot do to change the conditions that make so many non-citizens forever prisoners?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the day after the inauguration, I was actually scrolling on my Facebook feed because it's a very interesting historical document these days, right? I went back to 4 years ago on the date of the inauguration, and I had written a piece for Crimmigration right after Donald Trump was elected, and I had expressed a lot of emotions and a lot of fear and sadness. And I already knew that most of the things that I expressed and worried about actually were and largely coming true. What I also knew at the time was the federal government and the immigration system is a giant ship. It's just a giant ship that has a lot of momentum that's going in one direction. And I recognize that this machinery that was probably already starting to be constructed in George W.'s administration and then became more efficient and larger during Obama administration and really used to as much great effect during the Trump administration, really was there. But it would even take the Trump administration longer. And I think if the Trump administration was already had certain things in place that I think would have been worse than what we had seen. And what I had noticed on my sojourn through Facebook was that like the week after his inauguration, the travel ban was in place. And at the same time, that week was also the time where I had never seen so many people get together, go to airports, figure out ways to do things. And what I think the last 4 years has made very, very clear is that there's a more mature understanding of what institutions and legal institutions can actually do. There was a lot of times when the courts during the Muslim ban slowed things down. But of course, ultimately, Trump versus Hawaii came down and allowed it. There was a lot of times where I think Professor Young talked about, there was things that Trump couldn't do that he wanted to do. Well, that is in part because there was a lot more people doing what they could do to really slow things down. Communities rejecting ICE detention centers, communities trying to get state legislatures and state folks to really do certain things of what they do. Now, that's not to say that, the power of the people will always shine through. Unfortunately, this isn't a novel. And it requires a lot of hard work, and it requires a lot of sweat and tears. But when I'm reflecting on these 4 years, I just reflect on a little bit more on this idea that this should be a moment for more than just a course correction. This should be a moment where we really examine some of these long-standing historical underpinnings that we've seen. There's no question, right, that we've already had a movement about mass incarceration. There's no question that the immigration movement involves that. There's no question that there is a reckoning, when there's a reckoning of the racial justice aspect of our society, it, as Erika, as of course, it's evolved quite a bit through this history of xenophobia in the United States. And so it should be a moment of reckoning where you had a whole lot of people saying the right things in the aspect of being in part of the resistance. I think the question will be, will it just be because of the politics, or will it actually become fruitful where people are willing to really figure out a way to envision a new way of doing things? Like, there is really no reason, and I'll just say that right away, there's no reason we should be deporting people for crimes. I understand that there's this notion, right, that criminals, right, should be punished. Well, the criminal justice system, like it or love it, is there. Why do we, on top of that, need to deport them? And so I think there was a number of things. And of course, detention itself can and should be revisited, and hopefully we'll see. Whether or not Biden is leading or being pushed or dragged, I think is the other question. But no matter what, I'm less, I see it as part of a larger idea of what is potentially possible. I don't have any, I'm not naive in the idea that it will be easy or it will come without a whole lot of pain and hard work. So.
I'd like to just add that so many of the things that you mentioned, I think, are signs that the work of immigration historians and advocates and everyday people their understanding about how immigration works and institutionalized discrimination in our immigration system. I don't think that we can or will go back to a naive Obama era presence. I do think something has definitely changed. And I think that we're starting to see some of it in the laws. Elliot and I are part of a group of migration scholars who really came together the day after Trump was elected in 2016 to ask, what is our role? Elliot asked our Facebook group, what are we going to do when the deportation trains start going again? And we've recently started looking at the Biden policy so far. And one of the things that I noticed with the repeal of the Muslim ban was this section that said that the government will institute a review of all those who may have been affected, negatively impacted by the discriminatory ban. And the brief chatter so far has been, this seems new. I don't remember any sort of, other than the redress commissions for Japanese American internment and the apology movement for the Chinese exclusion, but this is direct. This is right after the law has been rescinded. So I think we'll see, I don't know. I'm holding on to, to some recognition that something has changed, even though I know, like you all, of these very long historical roots. We have a number of questions that have come in through the Q&A function, so I thought I would transition to those. And they're questions for some directed at one and some directed at both. So Alexandra Minister is joining us from University of Michigan, and she wonders how you assess detention camps in the context, so this is for Elliot, detention camps in the context of critical historical research on camps, including refugee, concentration, etc., as the ultimate sites for the control of quote unquote bare life, where human rights discourse and law has next to no traction. Most recently, I'm thinking about Irwin and the forced sterilization and her hysterectomies in this case. Elliot,
yeah, shout out to Alex, who's going to be up, I think, next week here with her amazing work. Yeah, I mean, these sites, one of the points of talking about mental institutions, then called insane asylums, is that I think immigration historians tend to focus a lot on immigrant detention facilities. And you have to think about all of these sites where people are incarcerated. So that could be regular jails and prisons for people who've committed crimes. But what I was surprised to find is that the vast majority of citizens and non-citizens at the beginning of the 20th century to the mid 20th century were in these mental hospitals. And these were places where it wasn't even clear that all the times the people who were put in there were in fact mentally ill. I think a lot of times immigrants were interpreted by doctors and immigrant inspectors as being mentally ill simply because they didn't follow or comport to the same cultural customs of white, waspy Americans. And so they got criminalized that way or pathologized that way. So I think that notion of these institutions as a place of bare life, where people are basically being experimented on in terms of medical experiments, where they're undergoing forced sterilizations, I see throughout this history. And in the second to last chapter, about the Mario Cubans in Atlanta, they had a doctor there who was openly admitting to experimenting on the detainees there, and the Cubans who were interviewed after being deported to Cuba talk about being shot up with all of these drugs, and the doctor basically saying that this is gonna, make you crazy. And so I think that these institutions very much have that role of, and it's, frightening to see that it has not ended, that this is happening now in these very same detention centers. So thank you for that question.
Next is Donna Gabatia from Toronto, who I think has a question more for Linus, and that is, I've often been told that entry without inspection or presence in the US without valid documents is a misdemeanor. Is that correct? And if so, what punishments are typical for other types of misdemeanors, like fines, as in the case of traffic violations, or anything else?
Yeah, without commenting on your specific situation, because I don't want to become on the hook for that. But yes, generally, entry without inspection is in fact a misdemeanor, and re-entry without inspection is a felony. Now, in one of the things that wasn't talked about today, but that became it's been in the history books since the 1920s, but it really wasn't enforced so much until the modern era of George W., President Obama for sure, and the Trump administration, I believe, has the last few years, it's the #1 crime being charged in US federal courts, not state courts, but federal courts. And most of the time, the convictions usually involve a fine that don't actually, depending on the situation, will not actually involve it, but can hold up to about 6 months of a sentence. Now, that usually is not necessarily what's going on in federal courts. They're usually going through the criminal process. And I just want to highlight, family separation was made possible because of these criminal charges. So the zero tolerance policy was effectively saying that because we were putting these mothers in federal criminal court to answer for misdemeanors, we had to take away their children in order to go through it. Now, that hadn't been the case before, but that certainly was the justification that was used, that, hey, we take away children from people in the criminal justice system, right? If you go down to Hennepin County Jail, obviously the people who are being arraigned in front of criminal court judges don't have their children with them. So the argument was, well, then it must be justified here. And so, yes, the answer is, it is a misdemeanor. Re-entry can be a felony, and it can carry, depending on whether there's an underlying crime, over 20 years of prison in a federal penitentiary for illegal re-entry. Sorry, that's a longer answer than I think the question was.
I have 2 more questions. One, I think both or either one of you could answer, and that's from Taylor Gunderson. And it is about how the current immigration detention system appears to be in violation of international law. And from Elliott's book, I'm thinking about the case of Japanese Peruvians, but also I'm sure Linus has insight into how the US responds to this, if at all, and what ways can legal and policy advocates pressure the US government in using international law on this?
Actually, a number of years ago, my students and I were involved with a case for a person who was being held in Arizona in detention, and we managed to get the Inter-American Court to make a ruling specifically that our client's detention was arbitrary. That is not a surprise. The problem, of course, is international tribunals have limited authority to do things like sanctions or requiring states. And one feature of the last 4 years under the Trump administration is how much they really hold international law generally in disdain. So it will be a question. I think it's going to be an ongoing question about how, just international law generally, about accountability under those international frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, the United States is an outlaw nation around the world, like drone strikes, killing people, political assassinations. There's a long history of this that stretches back and continues to this day. So I think international law is kind of ineffective in trying to hold the US accountable. In the case of the Japanese Peruvians, the US courts, when they were brought to this country, forced into this country, they were then detained as being illegal entrants. And when they tried to challenge this in court, the court said, we have no jurisdiction over how these people got here. All we can say is that, yes, when they got here, they didn't have the right documents. So the US courts weren't willing to look beyond the borders, and international courts don't have jurisdiction. And the Japanese Peruvians, who've been continuing to fight this battle, have tried to go to international bodies to get a ruling. But even if they do, I don't think it'll have an impact.
And our last question is for both of you, but starting with Linus, and that is, we're coming from the Immigration History Research Center, so this angle is how can historians, but really I would broaden it to anyone who's not a lawyer. So how can we help lawyers and other advocates, challenge today's immigrant detention system? What tactics have been the most effective? Maybe this is where you might talk about the Binger Center's project to bring volunteers into court and to keep track of what's happening in court. But just in general, what should we be thinking about to keep this momentum going? I think it's very clear that these Biden policies would not have seen the light of day without those protests, without the lawyers going to JFK and every other airport on the night of the Muslim ban, without all of these actions that so many have taken. So what else, what should we be doing to keep this momentum going, and hopefully, put in effect even more and lasting change?
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit abstractly, and then I'll give some concrete stuff. So abstractly, of course, the issue is obviously it's always important to be engaged, to make sure that you can do what anyone would want to be able to do as an engaged person in our society in the political dynamic, which would be, of course, writing letters or demanding accountability or making sure that you get involved locally. I mean, local politics has huge impact, right? I mean, things like the sheriff's election for Hennepin County had a huge impact on changing how immigration detainers worked in Hennepin County. Things like making sure that right now, and now I'm moving more towards concrete examples, being aware of when ICE comes out with a contract wanting to hold people in certain places. That was instrumental both in Illinois to stop the construction of an ICE detention center, and here in Minnesota. It's not clear to me what role it played, but it had a role in, for instance, preventing things like Appleton and other places becoming an immigration detention center. And then even more specifically to this date right now, for instance, one of the big debates that the Minnesota government is facing is whether and how to vaccinate. Vaccinating people who are in immigration detention should be, in my opinion, a priority. And right now, that is, something that could use the public input and voice on. But I think the idea too, in terms of engagement on a just one-on-one engagement. Oh, and of course, the Advocates for Human Rights, along with us, Advocates is a huge project, which is court observation. People can actually go sit and watch what detained court is like. And they come out with these wonderful reports lately, seeing what people are seeing in detained court and how much that's impacting. And there are efforts to use that kind of advocacy. The other thing is just constant conversation and really pushing back when people say things like the good immigrant, the bad immigrant, what it means for criminals, what that even means when we start calling people that term. So those are just small things.
Yeah, and I would add that when I started came at this from the perspective of how do we deal with immigrants in detention, it very quickly took me to mass incarceration, policing of citizens. And so, for instance, in Portland and Oregon, this is a sanctuary state. So local law enforcement is not supposed to be involved in immigration enforcement. What happens is, because of policing are picking up people for these low-level infractions, they get booked into the jail, the county jail. That information immediately goes to ICE. So basically, if you want to stop immigrant detention, what you have to do is convince your local authorities to stop criminalizing people for these low-level offenses, which will be a good thing not only for immigrants, but for lots of Black and brown citizens as well. In terms of, at the national level, I think, again, the proposal for immigration reform through Congress, I support it. It's great, but let's not waste a lot of political capital worrying about that, because I don't really think we're going to get 10 Republicans to join it. Let's try to put the pressure on Biden to do the things that he can do and to really step up. If he believes in these things, it shouldn't be about convincing 10 Republicans and all the Democrats. It should be about him using his power as president to do what he can do. And, commuting sentences is one of them. Ending detention is, immigrant detention is something I believe legally he can do. And then the final thing I would say is we just have to make it unacceptable that there are immigrants detained in our communities. So in Portland, the ICE detention center almost every night has protests in front of it. And I think that has to be happening around the country to make it basically, put yourself in front of the trains, the deportation trains, the deportation planes, the deportation buses. And the lawyers have a crucial role to play, but I believe the law follows society. And so we need to all get out there as we're able to stop this inhumane system.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Linus Chan from the University of Minnesota Law School. Thank you, Eliot Young from Lewis and Clark. Congratulations on your fabulous book. Please join us next week for another great program, Tuesday, February 2nd, 4 p.m. Central Time, on nativism, white supremacy, and the 2021 assault on the Capitol. It's going to be a really timely and fascinating discussion. And as we close out our program, we're going to try to share the book trailer one last time. If for some reason our tech difficulties continue, we will post the link on YouTube for you to view on your own time. But thank you again, and everyone stay well. Take care.
Bye. Forever Prisoners is a history of how, where, and why the United States put immigrants behind bars from the late 19th century until the present, and how it built the largest immigrant detention system in the world. From Chinese held in remote island prisons in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1880s, to tens of thousands of immigrants declared insane and locked up in mental hospitals at the beginning of the 20th century, immigrants viewed as undesirable have been caged indefinitely. Thousands of Japanese Peruvians labeled enemy aliens were kidnapped, brought forcibly to the United States, and put in INS detention camps during World War II. Seiichi Higashide and his family ended up in a detention camp in Crystal City, Texas, charged with illegal entry.
By the 1980s, tens of thousands of Haitians and Cubans seeking refuge in the United States were put into mass detention camps. In 1987, more than 2,000 Cuban refugees who had spent years being held indefinitely pending deportation took over prisons in Atlanta and Oakdale, Louisiana, held guards as hostages, and torched buildings. They came for freedom, but found themselves behind bars. More recently, millions of immigrants have been caught up in a harsh criminal justice system that penalizes minor offenses with permanent banishment. Myra Machado came to this country from El Salvador when she was just 5 years old. A decade after writing a hot check as a teenager, Myra was stopped with her 3 children in Arkansas for a minor traffic infraction. This arrest led to her deportation in 2017. A few months later, she returned to the U.S., was rearrested and sent back to ICE detention in Louisiana. Myra was deported in January 2020 while her appeal was still pending in the Fifth Circuit Court.